If you're here, you already sense there's something out there, something magical and mysterious, just waiting for you to find. And you've probably already discovered it isn't as easy as just thinking happy thoughts. You're not alone. Generations of shamans, philosophers, seers, and scientists have pursued this eternal quest. Where their ideas come together, you'll find powerful tools to cultivate magic and self-mastery in your own life. Welcome to the Magic and Mastery podcast. I'm your host, Donna Woodwell. I'm a former journalist, an author, a master astrologer, and a Hermetic initiate, and it's my honor to be your guide. In each episode, I'll meet you at the crossroads of science and spirit, reason and intuition, to help you discover the wisdom that works for you. Are you ready? The adventure awaits. Hello, and welcome to the Magic and Mastery podcast. This is episode 3, The Veil of Isis. With this Magic and Mastery podcast, we're certainly diving deep into the wellspring of magic. It's actually a double-length episode featuring history, metaphysical theories, even the nature of reality itself. I'd suggest making yourself a cup of tea and settling in for a while. As I've said before, my podcasts are, in a sense, meditations on magic. As such, they're rich fodder for contemplation, which is a nice way of saying that they are a little information dense. So, don't be surprised if you end up wanting to listen more than once, and that you hear something different every time. To make it easier to find the bits you're looking for, I've added headings and timestamps to the show notes, as well as links to all the references cited. I've also uploaded the episode transcript to Medium. There's a link for that too. Remember, you can find it all in the show notes at www.magicandmastery.com/podcast. And hey, it's not my fault if you end up buying lots of books. My students have called me the evil book temptress, and I proudly own it. And it's worse than usual this episode. Dare I say, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. Oh, and one more thing. Be sure to stay until the end when I share an experiment that you can try out for yourself and see how the magic works for you. Now let's get started. In the last episode, our magician stands at the crossroads, examining the things spread out on the table before him, and wonders. You see, our magician's already figured out that in order to create, in order to step into that coveted flow, he needs to simultaneously focus on mastering the task at hand while plugging in to an awareness that seems larger than himself. The paradox of it all tickles his mind. The magician muses to himself, if I can understand how creation occurs for all of this, maybe I can copy the pattern. Then I can learn to create like a god. So when we left our young mage, he was knocking at the door of the great mystery. So what exactly is this great mystery? Well, to my shamanic teacher, who was trained by a band of the Lakota tribe, the spirit of great mystery, Wakantanka, meant the mystery nestled in the heart of creation. The ancient Greek philosopher Plotinus called it to-en, the one, or that which has no divisions. And my Hermetic teacher, who had a modern flair with words, just called it up in the hologram. Now, however you conceive of it, the West Wing's presidential hopeful Mount Santos summed it up in a nice little soundbite. I'm sure that many of you would agree that at the beginning of all that begatting, something begun. Click, boom, and it happens. But how did it happen? Or perhaps a better question is, how is it happening? Well, when modern-day magicians investigate the cosmos, some use scanning electron microscopes or space-based telescopes or superconducting supercolliders bound together with a whole lot of math. Of course, ancient magicians had none of these cool toys. What they had were their own minds and senses, logic and felt experience. And still, what they conceived was astonishing, both in its consistency across cultures as well as its resonance with today's cosmological theories. But this is a podcast episode, not a book, so I'll try to keep it simple and just start with Plotinus. Plotinus was a philosopher who lived in late antiquity, the 3rd century of the Common Era to be precise. Born in the Nile Delta of northern Egypt, in his late 20s, the desire for knowledge sent him off on his own heroic journey. His first stop, Alexandria. Now, Alexandria was one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world and had been for nearly 5 centuries. And fortunately for Plotinus, not far from his hometown. 3rd century Alexandria was truly cosmopolitan, a world city. Scholars from around the globe, African Egypt and Ethiopia, European Italy, Greece and Turkey, Middle Eastern, Syria and Babylon, Asian, Persia, India, and beyond, all gathered in this bustling, polyglot cauldron to share ideas and philosophies. Not to mention create the largest library of the age, but I'll resist that digression. Plotinus spent a decade studying with his teacher Ammonius Saccas before setting off towards Persia and India to study with Eastern masters. Eventually, he made his way back to Rome, where he began teaching his own students. And though you may never have heard his name before, Plotinus' ideas have found their way into things I'm sure you've heard of, things like Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, as well as Gnostic and pagan metaphysics. In a sense, Plotinus' ideas were a nexus point. They emerged out of the world's collective wisdom and then seeded numerous traditions as they developed. Such was the elegance of his inner vision. And just as an aside, yes, Western civilization was born from the cross-pollinization of migrants with books. Deal with it. Now, for Plotinus, in the beginning, there was the one, whole and undifferentiated, pure potential and absolute rest. All right, so imagine for a moment that you are the one thing. If you're in a safe place, go ahead and close your eyes and really get into it. Imagine there are no boundaries, no edges. There's no light or dark, no hot or cold, no others of any kind, and therefore no self. Did you do it? If you did, you probably realized one thing very quickly. Oneness, as it turns out, isn't very interesting. Sure, it's omnipotent and omnipresent in a sense, but that's because it's the only thing. To Plotinus, the one isn't even conscious. That's because to be conscious requires self-awareness. And since the one has no boundaries, it can have no sense of self. I suppose Plotinus is lucky he didn't vanish in a puff of logic. But it's then that the mystery occurred. The oneness overflowed itself, reaching out, and in doing so, created. Or as my Hermetic teacher called it, thought which creates. Like the sun emanates light, oneness emanates two-ness, a duality capable of contemplating itself. Now, two-ness, it turns out, is much more interesting. From there, it's a slippery slope to everything. You can think of it as the primal yin and yang, because that's what it is. But Plotinus used the words nous and prime matter. Nous is the divine mind, or the forms and patterns of creation. And prime matter, something that receives and reflects the forms and patterns. If you're having Bible study flashbacks of the Spirit hovering over the waters, exactly that. The patterns of creation, the Spirit, require reflection, the water, to self-actualize. Now, Plotinus' concept is not unique. It's mirrored in the Jewish mystical tradition. For example, in the Kabbalah, Kether is the unknowable unity from which emanates Chokmah and Binah, the Great Father and the Great Mother. And together this divine pair creates the rest of the cosmos. And modern physics may not use the same esoteric language of the ancients, but they are the inheritors of its myriad implications. Now, I've heard it said that Albert Einstein once called geometry the relationship between things. The golden compass certainly can't make a circle without its 2 legs. When scientists talk about the holographic nature of information encoding in the universe, they're talking about a technology that requires the interference between 2 things. In the case of the hologram, that's an information-carrying wave and reference wave. Together, they produce an illusory three-dimensional image. The physicist David Bohm described the great cosmic hologram as the implicate order, that which is enfolded and unseen. The ghostly image the hologram generates is called the explicit order. This illusion is our observable cosmos. Their ideas certainly echo Plato's allegory of the cave, but I'll resist that digression as well. Nassim Haramein of the Resonance Project certainly plays in the same playground. In his theories, the quality spin is fundamental to all bodies in the cosmos. Spin occurs when density differentials force two poles to pull on one another, driving a kind of spiraling motion and change. In other words, interacting poles generate the movement that creates life. Without polarity, everything is barren. Like the tail-eating Ouroboros, natural systems feed back on themselves, generating all the complexity that we see around us. Such feedback loops are an essential ingredient in the fractal nature of the cosmos. When mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot described them mathematically, they became a cornerstone of chaos theory. Now, I could keep citing more science, but I'll remind myself again, this is a podcast episode, not a book. So, suffice it to say, while all is essentially one, we are manifesting as duality in order to create the world we see around us. Now, if these modern cosmologists and quantum physicists have picked up on the themes ancient philosophers explored, I promise it's not out of a jealous desire to crib from the best. Rather, it's from the simple fact that when patterns appear in multiple places and in multiple times, it's a safe bet to assume that the pattern itself is somehow fundamental to the fabric of reality. And working with the ramifications of this essential oneness expressed as two-ness is the raison d'être, the reason for being of the Hermetic arts. What is Hermeticism, besides some trendy word in New Age circles? Well, it's been called the accursed science, though it's not precisely a science in the way the word is commonly used today. Today's scientists tend to explore the world on the horizontal dimension, that extended reality of kickable objects that we can actually measure. In fact, it's when scientists stray from this horizontal that other scientists start getting a little nervous and either jump up to pull them back down, or if that fails, just shun them altogether. The risks of stepping off the garden path. In contrast, Hermeticism is a science that deals with the vertical dimension. It seeks to understand how creation occurs, as well as the implications of that knowledge for life here on Earth. Its ultimate goal, in a sense, is reunion with the divine. Even more specifically, Hermeticism is a tradition that includes the accursed sciences, like astrology, alchemy, and theurgy. When you hear the word astrology, you're probably imagining the modern, hey baby, what's your sign? That type that pervades modern culture. And astrology, as sun sign horoscope or personality, find your destiny descriptions, is certainly fun and entertaining. But it's not really how the ancients thought of astrology. To them, the study of the motions of the planets was a glimpse into the workings of the divine mind. The essential two of astrology are day and night, represented by the sun and the moon. And before you scoff, even modern-day science recognizes that the sun and moon are necessary for life to have arisen on Earth, at least the way we think about it. The sun provides the energy and heat that drives growth. The moon provides the gravitational tug that churns the oceans and stabilizes the climate for the eons required for complex evolution to occur. Skywatchers observe the 7 wandering stars, that's the sun, moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, moving in predictable patterns. And then they created a model of the cosmos based on these patterns and encoded it with their understandings of the mathematics of polarity, rhythm, and growth. Consequently, astrology generated a system of correspondence that classified everything in the manifest world. This grand unified theory of everything served as the backbone for medicine, weather prediction, and other scientific inquiries for nearly 100 generations. Astrology even co-evolved with Stoicism to create a philosophy on how to cope with the changing world. And it left a legacy so profound that its tendrils surround us even today. For example, when we were in school, we memorized 7 colors of the rainbow because Isaac Newton wanted a color for each planet. And we have 7 days of the week, one named for each planet, so every planetary god has its own holy day. Not to mention words like lunatic, martial, jovial, mercurial, saturnine, and venereal. Yep, planet words, all of them. Now, if astrology studied the mind of God and how it expresses in the manifest world, alchemy was its complementary opposite. Alchemists studied the manifest world, how that manifestation creeps back toward the divine. Alchemy begins with the idea that metals, if left in the ground long enough, will evolve toward gold, the perfect metal. And so lead transmutes into tin, tin becomes iron, and so on until it eventually evolves into gold. And so the alchemist sought to understand this natural process so she could replicate it and speed it up, thereby turning lead into gold. And I say she here because tradition holds that the first alchemist was a woman, and she wasn't the only one. The alchemy theory goes that through a series of chemical transformations using the primal pair, in this case, sulfur, representing fire, and mercury, representing water, the alchemist could transform gross matter into a more rarefied state. Or to paraphrase the psychologist Thomas More, to start the alchemical reaction, you first need a hot mess. And if you don't have a hot mess, you're going to have to create one. Again, before you scoff, modern chemistry and physics have indeed learned that one element can transform into another, and that the stars are nature's fusion furnaces that create the progression of all the elements from which we are made. Not to mention all the damn useful chemical processes the alchemists discovered for things that we rely on even today. But that's just the outer mechanics of alchemy. As the psychologist Carl Jung pointed out eloquently, the alchemical journey is an ideal metaphor for the human psychological process he called individuation. As we learn to observe and transmute our inner landscape, we become more whole, or, in the language of the ancients, more divine-like. Now, the third Hermetic science is theurgy, a word that translates to God work. It's a set of rituals and practices to enable the Hermetic adept to unite with the divine, essentially the Western path to enlightenment. Now, the reason you probably haven't heard the word theurgy is that the concept was, for obvious reasons, not encouraged by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church. The Church preferred to keep its monopoly as mediator for the divine. Astrology and alchemy, at least, had practical applications that the medieval world needed, and their more esoteric meanings could be downplayed or obscured. But not so with theurgy. Some things are just too glaring to hide. Nevertheless, even if you haven't heard the word theurgy, its practices haven't disappeared. As I mentioned earlier, some of the ideas are preserved in Stoicism. Others found root in the Catholic monastic traditions. For example, such as the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, founder of the Jesuit order. But there's still one place in pop culture that's preserved the theurgic tradition. It's actually encoded in the images of the tarot cards. Even if you don't know much about those, I'm sure you've seen tarot cards used in television and movies. They are certainly a convenient plot device. Plus, they look really cool. The secret of what makes tarot cards so powerful and compelling is what they are tapping into. They are a pictorial guide to the Western path to enlightenment. Or put another way, when you have the keys to understand the images in the tarot, you have a map for how to reconnect to the divine within you and the tools to help you out along the journey. I'll pause here for a minute and let that sink in. A little history might help. The tarot cards are the brainchild of the Italian Renaissance. They are essentially a precursor to a modern-day playing card deck with an extra fifth suit of cards. These extra triumph cards are likely inspired by Italian poet Petrarch's triumphal processions. These processions described one virtue winning out over the one before it to produce an ever more virtuous human. The earliest tarot decks likely appeared in Milan in northern Italy. They were hand-painted and used as a card game among the nobility, with various virtues and medieval figures joining in the procession, kind of like a medieval game of bridge. Meanwhile, over in Florence, the Italian scholar and philosopher Marsilio Ficino was beginning his translations of Plato, Plotinus, and the Corpus Hermeticum into Latin for the first time. And this ancient philosophy was all the rage in Florence, studied not just by other philosophers, but by poets and artists. So, here in northern Italy, we have these super trending new ideas about cosmology and the human condition bumping into a super trendy new card game. Again, click, boom, and it happens. The tarot eventually found its way to Marseille, France, where it was mass-produced on another snazzy new invention, the printing press. Over the next few centuries, French occultists recognized the hermetic threads woven into the cards. So they added reflections on card meanings from the Hermetic tradition and began to use them for divination. Now, in the Marseille version of the tarot, the cosmic duo is represented by the trickster, or the rogue, and the papist, a female pope. As you can probably tell by their names, there's something a little hermetical about this pair. Now, we explored the trickster in the last couple episodes, so let's give the papist her due. The papist card featured a crowned woman in flowing robes seated before two pillars with a veil stretched between them. In the Middle Ages, there was a persistent legend of Pope Joan, a cross-dressing woman who had risen through the ranks of the church and been elevated to the papacy. She would have continued her ruse, save that Joan died in childbirth in the middle of the Easter procession. Talk about turning the establishment order on its head. This story, as well as real-life accounts of women in religious leadership roles, tapped into Gnostic and dualistic ideas deemed heretical by the church. Years later, when Arthur Edward Waite, of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, set about to redraw the tarot cards to tie even more closely with the order's philosophy, he adopted other names for the cosmic duo. He called them the Magician and the High Priestess. Now, Waite's version adds even more detail to the card. The High Priestess is crowned with the horns of Isis. Her blue and white robes flow around her, spilling over a crescent moon by her feet. The two pillars behind her are colored black and white, representing the cosmic polarity of yin and yang. They are labeled Boaz and Yakin, a reference to the Masonic tradition about the pillars in front of the Temple of Jerusalem. Now, she sits in between the two pillars because the High Priestess understands that both polarities are equally important in the manifestation of the world. Behind her, stretched in between the two pillars, is a veil embroidered with palm trees and pomegranates, representing the masculine and feminine principles. The veil of Isis separates the outer temple from the holy inner sanctum. Peeking through from behind the veil, you can see an ocean, a metaphor for the one, or the absolute, as Yitzhak Bentov calls it in his work, Stalking the Wild Pendulum. To paraphrase, the absolute is the result of infinite speed, which appears as absolute rest, and therefore infinite potential. On her lap lies a scroll labeled Torah. It's both a reference to the Hebrew scriptures, a word meaning law, guide, or teaching, as well as an anagram for tarot. The scroll remains closed, a silent truth and a reminder that it's the spirit of the law that matters, and that revelation comes through direct experience, not language. Well, as I'm sure you can tell by now, the High Priestess card is richly symbolic and multi-layered. But perhaps more than anything, she's a promise that the cosmos is far grander than physical appearances. And with the right understanding, one could reunite with the divine realm once again. So, when paired with the Magician, she reminds us of the duality in all things. The magician is standing, the high priestess is seated. The magician is power in action, whereas the high priestess is power in contemplation. The magician seeks, while the high priestess lets herself be found. But never forget, it's the high priestess who serves as the gatekeeper and guardian between the two realms, material and immaterial. The magician may create wonders in the world with the energy of the divine, but the pathway to the return to the absolute leads through intuition, not through reason. I know, right? There's a lot of really cool information here. But what you can do with it is even cooler. Now, on the physical level, you'll quickly realize that your body is a chorus of interlocking cycles of activity and rest. There's waking and sleeping, there's your heartbeat, even your breath. And you need both. And in balance, or you get sick and die. Talk about a feedback loop. Now, on the psychological level, you're also balancing in between your conscious awareness and your unconscious mind, or the verbal and nonverbal parts of yourself. Believe it or not, science suggests the verbal part of our mind processes about 40 bits of information per second, while in contrast, the nonverbal part of our brain processes about 11 million bits of information per second. Now, the author Daniel Kahneman explores this duality at length in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And Daniel Goleman explores the implications for our ability to focus in his book, Focus, the Hidden Driver of Excellence. The lesson of both books is that the hard-charging, constant busyness of modern culture is doomed to fail, because without recognizing the need for rest, to take breaks, to unplug and tap into our intuition, you can never truly reach your full creative potential. In other words, it's our intuition which permits contact between our unconscious and the world of pure mystical experience. Intellect that is not fertilized by the imagination and other mysterious bits of us is sterile. And that's just the implications on the physical and psychological levels. Of course, you can go even higher and deeper into the spiritual realms, and that's what Hermeticism is designed to do. As I mentioned earlier in the podcast, in addition to Hermetic philosophy, there are practical spiritual exercises to help you on your path. Now, there's a handy little book called The Kabbalion, written about 100 years ago, that can help you get started. And it's free on Amazon Kindle, by the way. I included the link in the show notes for you. I figured you'd ask. A few Hermetic principles derived from this cosmic duality include the principle of vibration, polarity, and rhythm. The principle of vibration says, nothing rests, everything moves, everything vibrates. This implies that you can learn how to raise or lower your personal vibrations, which allows you to resonate with different groups of people, nature, or spirit. I know that sounds new agey, but it's also literally true. With the help of a biofeedback device, you could even watch your own brainwaves, heart rate, skin conductivity, vibrations all change with your state of awareness. Meditation and hypnosis are, of course, the royal road to learning how to tune your inner radio, so to speak. Now, the principle of polarity suggests everything is dual. Opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree. Extremes meet and all truths are half-truths. In our incredibly polarized world, the implications of this principle are profound. But let's keep it focused on you for a moment. This principle holds a key to your emotional self-regulation. There are actually no hard lines between emotions, only degrees of intensity, flavor, or direction. When you can think of emotions this way, you can imagine that you have a kind of slider or a tuner that you can gently move between emotional stations, one blending into another. In other words, if you don't like what's playing on your emotional radio, change the station. In this way, you can master your own emotional responses rather than allow them to run away with you. And finally, the principle of rhythm says, everything has tides. All things rise and fall. The pendulum swing manifest in everything. All things have a season. It's natural law to swing from one to another. But the the Hermetic adept learns to use the principle rather than be used by it. This was one of the early purposes of astrology, and its spiritual practices are preserved in Stoicism and elsewhere, including in my own coven. For the moment, why don't you consider embracing the paradox on all levels? Whew, I know, that was one epic episode, but this seems like a good place to take a break. I know you've got a lot to process, especially on those deeper layers of yourself. Don't worry, in the next chapter of our journey, we'll explore the fruits of the union of this cosmic duo. In other words, the sacred marriage of Eros and Logos in the material world. Let's go play in the garden. I've got an apple waiting for you. In the meantime, let's get started with this week's experiment. This is a simple exercise that can help you play with the principle of polarity. First, find a comfy place to sit. Now, take a nice, slow breath in. And as you do, imagine your body filling up with sparkling energy. If you want, you can add a visualization to go with it, seeing yourself dancing or laughing or any other happy place. Take a moment to notice how you feel. If you feel good, go ahead and take in another slow, energizing breath, but no more than about 3 times. After you've filled up, so to speak, it's time to do the complementary opposite. Switch your focus to breathing out. And as you release your breath, feel the energy flowing back out of you, carrying with it any tension in your body. Breathe in and out again, releasing more tension as you breathe out. Feel yourself relaxing and sinking into the chair with each breath. Focus on your out breath maybe 6 times or until you start feeling chill. Enjoy the sensation for a moment, and then switch back to focusing on the energizing breath. Breathe in energy until you're feeling just the right level of alertness for you. This little exercise, which for most people takes barely a minute, is priceless for learning resilience and emotional self-regulation. Some modern thinkers are already calling self-regulation one of the most important life skills of the 21st century overloaded world. And now you can play with it for yourself. If you want to learn more about these kinds of Hermetic spiritual exercises, share your results from this week's experiment, or just ask me questions, you can find me in my magical community, the Magic and Mastery Coven. You can find out more about it at www.magicandmastery.com/coven. As I mentioned earlier, if you want to know more about this week's episode, check out the show notes at www.magicandmastery.com/podcast. They include timestamps, as well as links to the authors and books, and to the transcript. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Magic and Mastery with me, your host, Donna Woodwell. And as I've said before, I love getting feedback. It helps me to know what makes you jazzed so I can provide more of the good stuff. So it would mean so much to me if you take a moment to rate and review the podcast. And if you do like it, why don't you share it with a friend? Don't forget to join us next week when we return to the garden, where we'll explore the sacred marriage of Logos and Eros. Until then, may the magic be with you.